A cruel man abandons his mother with amnesia at an airport upon discovering a hidden inheritance. He tries to stop the plane, but it's too late. What follows is devastating. Carlos Mendoza gazed at his mother with a blend of frustration and exhaustion. Elena, 75 years old, sat in her favorite chair with a vacant stare, her once vibrant brown hair now completely white and unkempt. The wrinkles on her face seemed deeper than Carlos remembered. "Mother, can you hear me?" Carlos asked, raising his voice more than necessary. Elena blinked slowly and turned her head toward him as if just noticing his presence. "Carlos, you are my son," she replied with a trembling voice. Carlos, clenching his fists to contain his irritation, said, "Yes, Mother, it's me. I've told you 1,000 times I'm not a boy anymore. I'm 48. Elena offered a faint smile, her eyes briefly shining with a glimmer of recognition. "Of course, my dear, how could I forget?" she said, then returned to her world of silence and confusion. The amnesia diagnosis had come 2 years ago, but for Carlos, it felt like an eternity. His once ambition-filled life now revolved around caring for a woman who barely remembered who he was half the time. As he prepared dinner in the kitchen, Carlos couldn't help but reflect on how things had changed. He remembered his mother as a strong, loving woman always willing to sacrifice for him. Now, that woman had vanished, replaced by a stranger requiring constant attention. The sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. It was Lucia, the nurse who came 3 times a week. Carlos greeted her with obvious relief. Lucia asked quietly, and Carlos responded, the weariness evident in his voice. "Sometimes, I think it would be easier if he stopped," he said, embarrassed by his own thoughts, but also with a hint of reproach. "Carlos," she said gently, "it's your mother." He nodded, feeling guilty, but deep down, a dark idea began to form, an idea that would change their lives forever. As night fell over the city, Carlos sat in his office, surrounded by old papers and faded photographs. The frustration of recent years weighed heavily on his shoulders like a stone. With trembling hands, he opened a drawer that hadn't been touched in years, searching for something, anything, that might ease the financial burden of caring for his mother. Among old bills and forgotten mementos, his fingers brushed against a yellowed envelope. He took it out with curiosity, noting the seal of a notary he didn't recognize. When he opened it, he found a letter from his late father, dated just a few months before his death. "Dear son," the letter began, "there is something you should know about him." Carlos read the letter eagerly, his heart pounding, as it detailed a substantial inheritance hidden away for years with reasons his father hadn't clearly explained. It mentioned foreign accounts and properties Carlos knew nothing about, stating that his mother held all the information. "She is the key to accessing this legacy," the letter concluded. Carlos's mind raced with thoughts of a hidden inheritance and his mother as the key. He looked at the closed door of his office, imagining Elena sitting in the living room, lost in her fragmented memories. Greed and desperation mixed within him. For a moment, he envisioned a different future, free from debts and worries. But reality struck hard. His mother, in her current state, was unable to provide any coherent information. Carlos ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of years of resentment and sacrifice. How long had Eleanor kept this secret? Why hadn't she told him before illness consumed her? Bitterness overwhelmed him. His entire adult life had been a constant struggle, and now he discovered that his reality could have been different. His frail, absent mother mixed in his mind with the promise of wealth and freedom. At that moment, a dark idea began to take root in his mind, an idea that both terrified and tempted him. If his mother were no longer able to care for herself, wouldn't it be better for everyone to find a permanent solution? Carlos closed his eyes, fighting the whirlwind of emotions threatening to drown him. The decision he made that night would forever change the course of their lives. Dawn found Carlos with deep, dark circles and a steely determination. He had spent the night planning, calculating every detail of what he was about to do. Guilt and anticipation churned in his stomach as he prepared Elena's breakfast. "I have a surprise for you," he said, with forced sweetness. Elena looked at him with wavering eyes, a glimmer of curiosity breaking through her confusion. "A surprise, Carlos?" Carlos nodded, forcing a smile. "We're going on a trip, Mother. A very special trip." As he helped Elena dress, Carlos mentally reviewed his plan. He had booked 2 plane tickets to a distant destination, but only one was for the return trip. His mother's suitcase was packed with old clothes and unmarked items, and he had placed a prepaid phone with fake numbers inside. "Where are we going?" Elena asked as he brushed her hair with unusual care. "It's a surprise, Mother," Carlos replied, avoiding her gaze in the mirror. Every gesture of tenderness from Elena felt like a dagger to Carlos's heart. He recalled childhood moments of his mother comforting him while learning to ride a bike, supporting him through every fall, but those memories were quickly fading under the weight of the years. As Carlos loaded the bags into the taxi, he noticed his hands were trembling with a mix of resentment and the promise of a better life. Elena, sitting on the porch and humming a forgotten tune, was oblivious to her son's inner turmoil. "Are you ready for our adventure?" she asked Carlos as he helped her to her feet. Elena smiled with genuine warmth, lighting up her wrinkled face. "With you, I'm always ready, my son." Her words nearly shattered Carlos's resolve. For a moment, he considered abandoning the plan, confessing his intentions, and seeking help. However, the image of the letter and the promise of a carefree life pushed him forward as the taxi drove away from their home. Carlos took one last look at the house they had shared, mentally reviewing each detail of his carefully crafted plan. The airport was a silent torment. Elena, excited about the surprise, pointed at things through the window, unaware of the true destination her son had in mind. Carlos gripped his mother's hand, feeling the weight of his decision. The airport loomed on the horizon, marking the point of no return. Amid the bustling crowd, Carlos maneuvered Elena's wheelchair, dodging rolling luggage and travelers. His heart pounded, threatening to betray his nervousness. He leaned forward, forcing a reassuring smile. "We're at the airport, Mother. Remember, we're going on a trip." Elena nodded slowly, her eyes drifting around, reflecting a mix of wonder and fear. He felt a pang of guilt, but quickly pushed it aside as they queued for check-in. Carlos mentally reviewed the situation. He had booked a flight to a remote city with multiple layovers, aiming to make the journey as complicated as possible. "Passports, please," the counter clerk requested with a professional smile. Carlos's hand trembled, feeling every second stretch into eternity. He hoped no one would notice anything unusual. The clerk finally handed back the documents, saying, "Have a good trip." A sigh of relief escaped Carlos's lips as they moved towards security. Elena began to get restless. "Carlos, I don't feel well. I want to go home." Panic surged through Carlos momentarily. "Calm down, Mother. Everything's fine. We'll be on the plane soon and you can rest." They passed through security without incident, though Carlos felt every glance from the guards was accusatory. Eleanor, oblivious to everything, continued to hum softly, lost in some distant memory. They finally reached the waiting area, with an hour remaining before boarding, stretching before him like an abyss of doubt and regret. "Stay here, okay?" Carlos said, positioning Elena's wheelchair in a secluded corner. Elena looked at him with pleading eyes. "Don't be late, son. Don't leave me alone." Her words pierced Carlos's heart like a dagger. For a moment, all his resolve wavered. He saw in his mother's eyes the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything for him, but the image of the inheritance and a worry-free life prevailed. With one last look at Elena, Carlos walked away, struggling against the urge to run back and abandon the plan. Each step took him further from his mother, and the point of no return drew nearer. Carlos knew that the decision he made in the next few minutes would determine the rest of his life. The clock at the terminal read 10:45 when Carlos, with his heart racing uncontrollably, glanced back at Elena, sitting in her wheelchair, her eyes lost among the comings and goings of travelers. Her fragile and solitary figure stood in painful contrast to the bustling airport. With heavy steps, Carlos made his way back to his mother. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm going to get some magazines for the trip. Stay here, okay? I'll be back soon." Elena nodded absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on a distant point. "Carlitos, you know I don't like being alone." Her words almost shattered Carlos's determination. For a moment, he saw the woman who had been by his side through all his difficulties, but the image quickly faded, replaced by years of suffering, resentment, and the promise of a better life. With one final glimpse, Carlos moved further away. Each step was a battle against the urge to turn back. He blended into the crowd, feeling as though every eye was on him, judging him. At the terminal exit, a taxi waited. Before entering, he looked back one last time at the airport. Elena was barely visible, a solitary figure amidst the chaos. "Where to, sir?" the taxi driver asked. Carlos hesitated, his voice barely a whisper as the taxi pulled away. He was filled with horror. He had done the unthinkable. He had left his own mother vulnerable. Confused and in an unfamiliar place, the return journey home was a silent torment for Carlos. He imagined Elena slowly realizing her solitude and calling him with a trembling voice. What would happen when someone found her? How long would it take to uncover what she had done upon arriving home? The silence that greeted him was like an accusation. The photos of Elena on the walls seemed to reproach him. Carlos collapsed onto the couch, overwhelmed by the weight of his actions. It was then that he noticed the yellowed envelope on the coffee table, the letter from his father that had set this madness in motion. With trembling hands, he opened it again, searching for justifications for his deeds. But as he read, a detail he had previously overlooked caught his attention, causing his heart to stop. At that moment, Carlos realized he had made the worst mistake of his life, with consequences that would be devastating. The silence of the house was deafening. As Carlos frantically reread the letter, his hands shook uncontrollably and cold sweat dripped down his back. The letter now stood out with painful clarity. "The inheritance is conditional," it stated. "It can only be claimed if Elena gives her explicit consent before the notary. Without it, everything will be lost." The realization struck Carlos like a blow. Not only had he cruelly abandoned his mother, but he had also sabotaged his only chance to claim the inheritance. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. In desperation, Carlos began to rummage through the papers scattered on the table, searching for any clue about Elena's whereabouts. He found the flight itinerary he had booked for her and realized the plane would have already taken off. Without wasting a moment, he dialed the airport number with trembling fingers. "I need to cancel a flight," he told the operator urgently. "Flight 247 to Ciudad del Este departed 20 minutes ago," the operator informed him. Carlos felt his world collapse around him. His mother, with her fragmented memory, was on a plane to an unknown destination, taking with her any chance of claiming the inheritance. In a panic, Carlos rushed out of the house, jumped into his car, and sped towards the airport. His mind was a whirlwind of catastrophic scenarios. What if Elena had a confusion episode mid-flight and got lost in a strange city? Arriving at the airport, he dashed to the information desk, breathless and sweating. "My mother, flight 247. I need to find her," he managed to say between heavy breaths. The compassionate look of the staff only heightened his anguish. "Sir, the flight is already airborne. There's nothing we can do until—" Carlos collapsed into a nearby chair, the weight of his actions crashing down on him like a heavy stone. He had ruined his entire relationship with his mother, the inheritance, and possibly Elena's life. Tears began to stream down his face. Carlos realized this was just the beginning of a long and painful journey. He would have to move mountains to find Elena, face the legal repercussions of his actions, and, most challenging of all, live with the guilt of betraying the person who loved him most in the world. The airport clock ticked relentlessly every second, with Elena growing farther away. Carlos plunged into a chasm of remorse and despair. The following hours became a frantic nightmare for Carlos, sitting in the cold, sterile airport waiting room. With trembling hands, Carlos dialed the airline number again, pleading for information about his mother. For the umpteenth time, he was met with the same response. No details available during the flight. In desperation, Carlos approached the security desk, confessing, "I abandoned my mother. I need to find her." The guard's face shifted from surprise to indignation. "Are you telling me you intentionally left an elderly person at the airport?" In minutes, Carlos found himself surrounded by police, bombarded with questions about why he did this and where his mother was. Realizing he had committed a crime, Carlos was escorted to an interrogation room, watching his world crumble. His plan, which had seemed flawless hours ago, now revealed itself as a cruel and poorly thought-out scheme. In the cold, stark room, Carlos faced the harsh reality of his actions, confessing everything: the inheritance, his resentment, the abandonment plan. Each word he uttered dragged him deeper into a pit of shame and guilt. "Detective," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "the thought of what could happen to an elderly woman with amnesia in a foreign country." The question hit Carlos like a punch to the stomach. Images of Elena, confused and frightened in an unfamiliar city, flooded his mind. As the officers discussed the charges against him, Carlos slumped in his chair, weighed down by the gravity of his actions. The detective informed him that an international alert had been issued to locate Elena, who would land in Ciudad del Este in approximately 3 hours. "We'll do everything possible to intercept her, but I can't promise anything." Carlos nodded, unable to speak as the reality of the situation hit him in waves. He might lose his mother forever, face criminal charges, and the inheritance he coveted was now further away than ever. As he was led to a cell, Carlos looked at his reflection in the mirror, not recognizing the man staring back at him. Deep-set eyes, a face ravaged by guilt and fear. What had become of him? The cell door slammed shut, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts and the relentless ticking of the clock, marking each second that Eleanor spent alone and disoriented on a plane heading into the unknown. Time dragged on torturously in the detention cell. Carlos sat on the hard metal bench, his hands clasped tightly as he reviewed a book. The events leading to this moment outside the airport were chaotic. Search teams had been mobilized, coordinates relayed, and an international security network activated to locate Elena Mendoza. "Mr. Mendoza," the detective's voice broke through his thoughts, "your mother's flight will land in 20 minutes. We need more information." Carlos looked up, his eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "What more can I tell you? I've already shared everything." The detective sat down across from him, his face a mix of disgust and professional resolve. "We need more details about your mother's mental state. Any information could be crucial to locating her within the next hour." Carlos recounted every fragment he could remember about Elena's habits, moments of clarity and fears. Each word was a painful reminder of the woman he had betrayed. The cell door suddenly swung open. "The flight has landed," an officer announced, panting, "but there is no sign of Mrs. Mendoza among the passengers." Carlos's world seemed to freeze. "What do you mean?" he asked, trembling. The detective gravely explained that his mother had never boarded the plane. The revelation hit Carlos like a bucket of cold water. Elena wasn't in Ciudad del Este. She hadn't left the originating airport. Where could she be then? The following moments were a whirlwind of activity as Carlos was taken back to the airport, this time in handcuffs and escorted by police. Security footage was frantically reviewed for any sign of Elena's whereabouts. As he watched the screens, Carlos's heart stopped. Elena briefly appeared on camera before vanishing into the crowd. The last image showed her being approached by an unknown man. "Who is that?" the detective demanded, pointing to the man on the screen. Carlos shook his head, panic rising within him. "I don't know him. I don't recognize him." The realization struck everyone present like a cold wave. Elena Mendoza was not only lost, but there was now a possibility she had been kidnapped. The detective turned to Carlos, his gaze more intense than ever. "Mr. Mendoza, your negligence not only put your mother in danger, but may have facilitated a much more serious crime." Carlos collapsed into a chair, the weight of his actions crushing him. The search for Elena was no longer just about finding a confused, elderly woman. It had become a race against time to save her from unknown dangers. As officers mobilized around him, Carlos was paralyzed by the horror of what he had unleashed. The nightmare was just beginning, and the road to redemption, if there was one, would be long and painful. The search for Elena spread like wildfire. Carlos, still in police custody, watched helplessly as dozens of officers combed through every corner of the building. "We need to expand the search," the lead detective declared with a voice tense with urgency. "Mr. Mendoza, do you recognize the man in the footage?" Carlos shook his head, guilt eating away at him. "No, I've never seen him before." As investigators formulated theories, a young officer ran up. "Sir, we have a lead. A taxi picked up an elderly, disoriented woman a few hours ago." Carlos's heart leapt. "Where was she taken?" "The taxi driver dropped her off at a bus station across town," the officer replied. The news sparked a new wave of activity. Search teams were immediately dispatched to the bus station, while others continued to track the mysterious man from the footage. Carlos, escorted by 2 officers, was taken to the station for a more thorough interrogation. For hours, he recounted every detail of his life with Elena, searching for any clue that might help find her. "Did she ever mention places she wanted to visit?" the detectives asked, probing for details from her moments of clarity. Carlos struggled to remember, his guilt and fear clouding his thoughts. Suddenly, a memory surfaced from the depths of his mind. She used to talk about a town called San Miguel. The detective's eyes widened. "San Miguel de Allende?" Carlos exclaimed, a glimmer of hope igniting in his chest. An alert was immediately issued to all bus terminals and train stations heading to San Miguel de Allende. The idea that Elena, in her confusion, might have tried to return to her original location seemed plausible. As the search intensified, Carlos was returned to his cell. Hours dragged by, each minute a torment of uncertainty and remorse. Early in the morning, an officer burst into the cell. "We have news," he announced, his face unreadable. "A woman matching your mother's description was seen boarding a bus to San Miguel de Allende." Carlos jumped, but then the officer added, "The bus was in an accident on the road. Several passengers were injured." The world seemed to freeze for Carlos. The possibility that his mother might have been hurt or worse because of his actions was more than he could bear. As he was taken back for questioning, Carlos realized that this nightmare was far from over, and that the consequences of his selfishness could be even more devastating than he had imagined. In the early hours of the morning, Carlos found himself in a state of indescribable anguish. The news of the bus accident triggered a storm of emotions that threatened to engulf him completely. "We need you to come with us," said an officer, opening the door of his cell. "The injured have been transferred to the General Hospital of San Miguel de Allende. We need to identify the passengers." The patrol ride was a silent torment for Carlos, who was handcuffed and escorted, watching the blurred landscape pass by the window, his mind a whirlwind of catastrophic scenarios. When they arrived at the hospital, chaos was palpable. Distraught relatives filled the waiting room, and medical staff rushed back and forth. Carlos was led through sterile corridors, the smell of disinfectant churning his stomach. "It's already nauseating in here," a nurse pointed, directing them towards the intensive care unit. Carlos felt his legs might give way at any moment. Each bed they passed was a new shock, wondering if Eleanor might be the next one. How would he find her? The nurse pulled back a curtain. and Carlos's heart stopped for a moment. There, connected to various machines, lay an elderly woman with a swollen and bruised face. "Is she?" the detective asked quietly, studying every detail of the woman's face, desperately searching for any familiar trace. The more he looked, the more doubt he had. "I'm not sure," he finally murmured. "She looks like it, but—" The detective let out a sigh of frustration. "Mr. Carlos, we need to be certain. This woman has no identification, and her condition is critical." Carlos felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. What if this was Eleanor, and he didn't recognize her because of her injuries? Or what if it wasn't her, and they were wasting valuable time? At that moment, the woman in the bed slightly opened her eyes, her confused and pained gaze falling on Carlos. "Mother," Carlos whispered, leaning over her. The woman blinked slowly, her lips moving with effort. "Who are you?" she managed to articulate with a hoarse voice. Carlos's heart sank. It wasn't Elena. The search continued, and with each passing minute, the chances of finding his mother alive dwindled. In the intensive care unit, the detective received a call with a tense face. Upon hearing the information, he told Mr. Mendoza, hanging up the phone, "We found a lead on the man we saw in the airport footage. It appears he is connected to a human trafficking network." Carlos felt as if the ground was giving way beneath him. The possibility that Elena had fallen into the hands of traffickers was a nightmare he dared not imagine. Guilt and horror mixed within him, threatening to drown him as he was escorted back to the vehicle. Carlos understood that the search for his mother had become a race against time with potentially devastating consequences. The enormity of what he had unleashed with his selfish act struck Carlos with overwhelming force, and he knew that no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same. The return to the city was a whirlwind of sirens and frantic radio communications. Carlos, slumped in the back seat of the patrol car, heard fragments of conversations that sent chills down his spine. Possible links to a trafficking network, recent sightings in the northern zone. Time is critical. Upon arriving at the police station, Carlos was taken to an interrogation room. The chief detective, with pronounced dark circles under his eyes and a coffee cup in hand, was waiting. "Mr. Mendoza," he said gravely, "the situation has worsened. We need every detail about your mother's routine, her habits, anything that could help us predict her movements in the coming hours." Carlos recounted every memory, every piece of information about Elena, describing her moments of clarity, how she sometimes confused the present with the past, and her preferences for certain places in the city. He mentioned a park, recalling suddenly that she used to visit it and sometimes saw his father there on good days. "She asked me to take her there," Carlos said. The detective leaned in, intrigued. "Which park?" "The Lovers' Park," Carlos answered, bringing a wave of bittersweet memories. Instantly, a message was sent to the team at the park. While awaiting news, an officer entered with new information about the mysterious man from the airport. The officer revealed that the individual was Javier Morales, known for his connections to a network that exploits the elderly and vulnerable. The revelation hit Carlos like a ton of bricks. The thought of his mother being in the hands of such a person was unbearable. "How do they operate?" the detective asked with a trembling voice. The officer grimly explained, "They prey on elderly individuals with cognitive issues, manipulating them to access their bank accounts. In some cases, they even use them for identity fraud." Carlos felt as if the world was collapsing around him. His vulnerable and confused mother was at the mercy of ruthless criminals, all because of him. At that moment, the radio crackled. "Unit 7, we've located a woman matching the description at Lovers' Park. She appears disoriented and is talking to a man fitting Morales' description." Carlos's heart skipped a beat. It has to be her. Without wasting a second, the detective ordered an operation. Despite his detainee status, Carlos was transported in a patrol car toward the park. As they approached, the tension was palpable. Would they arrive in time? Would Eleanor be safe? Carlos, anxiously peering out the window, prayed for a chance at redemption, fully aware that his mother's fate was hanging by a thread he himself had severed with his unforgivable selfishness. Lovers Park, once a place of happy memories, had now become the epicenter of a tense police operation that encircled the area. Undercover officers mingled with unsuspecting passers-by, while Carlos, still in handcuffs, watched from inside a police vehicle, his heart pounding as he scanned each face, desperately searching for Elena. "There," the detective whispered, pointing to a distant bench. And then Carlos saw her, sitting with her frail figure hunched over. Beside her, a dark-looking man, undoubtedly Javier Morales, was speaking to her in a low voice, his hand resting with false camaraderie on Elena's shoulder. Carlos murmured through tear-blurred vision, signaling for the operation to commence. Officers moved in from all directions with calculated precision, but something went wrong. Morales, with his street-honed reflexes, spotted the movement instantly. He sprang up, grabbing Elena by the arm. "Stop him!" the officer shouted. Chaos erupted as Morales, using Elena as a shield, began to retreat toward an exit. The elderly woman, confused and terrified, stumbled, barely able to stay upright. Carlos couldn't hold back any longer. He threw open the vehicle door and ran toward his mother. "Mr. Mendoza, stop!" the detective yelled, but Carlos was already halfway there. "Mom!" Carlos shouted, his voice choked. "It's me, Carlos!" Elena turned her head when she heard his name. For a fleeting moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. Carlos's voice, barely audible amidst the chaos, pleaded, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." That moment of distraction was all the police needed. An officer tackled Morales, separating him from Elena, while others subdued the criminal. Within seconds, Carlos reached his mother, falling to his knees before her, his hands resting on her back. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he repeated, his words catching in his throat. Elena gazed at him, a mix of confusion and recognition in her eyes. "I'm sorry, my son," she said softly, her trembling hand reaching out to touch Carlos's face. "Where have you been?" Her words, filled with a love Carlos had longed for, broke him. He began to cry uncontrollably, years of resentment and guilt melting into a flood of tears. As the agents secured the area and paramedics attended to Elena, Carlos remained on his knees, knowing that this moment of reunion was just the beginning of a long and painful journey toward redemption. The afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden light, as if nature itself wanted to underscore the fragility and beauty of the love between a mother and her son, a love that, despite everything, had survived the harshest of trials. San Rafael Hospital buzzed with activity as Elena underwent a thorough medical evaluation. Carlos, still in police custody, but with his handcuffs temporarily removed, waited in the adjacent room, his face a mask of anxiety and regret. Detective Chief Ramirez entered the room with a serious expression. "Mr. Mendoza, we need to talk." Carlos nodded, bracing himself for the worst. "The doctors have completed their initial assessment," Ramirez began. "Physically, your mother is stable, but—" Carlos interrupted, fear tightening his throat. "The stress of the past few days has worsened her condition. Her amnesia seems to have deepened." The words hit Carlos like a dead weight. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked. Ramirez continued in a softer tone. "Elena is experiencing extended periods of confusion. Sometimes she believes she's in the past, other times she doesn't recognize her surroundings." Carlos slumped in his chair, overwhelmed by guilt. "Is it permanent?" he asked. "It's too early to say," Ramirez replied, "but the doctors are concerned. It seems Elena might be hiding something beyond just amnesia." "What are you saying?" Carlos asked, anxious. "They've found signs of an untreated heart problem. Elena will need further tests, but surgery might be required." The news hit Carlos like a punch to the stomach. Not only had he neglected his mother, but he hadn't even realized she was ill. How long had Eleanor been suffering in silence? At that moment, a nurse rushed in. "Sorry, but Mrs. Mendoza is asking for her son. She seems to be having a moment of clarity." She looked at the detective, who nodded in tacit permission. Entering Eleanor's room, Carlos felt his heart sink. His mother looked so small and fragile in that hospital bed. "Mum?" Carlos called, his voice weak but clear. "Come here, son," Elena replied. Carlos approached and took his mother's hand. "I'm here, Mum." Elena interrupted him. "Listen, I don't have much time before the confusion returns. There's something you need to know about your father's inheritance." Carlos listened in stunned silence as Elena revealed long-hidden family secrets, each word adding another piece to a puzzle that had been incomplete for years. Exhausted from the effort, Carlos felt tears streaming down his face. The long-sought truth, now revealed, was more complex and painful than he had ever imagined. As Elena drifted into an uneasy sleep, Carlos stayed by her side, holding her hand. Outside the room, Detective Ramirez awaited to resume the interrogation and legal procedures. Carlos knew the upcoming process wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Redemption would be a challenging and lengthy journey, but now he had a reason to pursue it. The unconditional love of a mother who, despite everything, had never stopped believing in him. The following days were a whirlwind of medical exams and police statements, shuttling between the hospital room and the police station, barely catching any sleep, while Eleanor's condition fluctuated between moments of clarity and deep confusion. One afternoon, as Carlos kept vigil by his mother's bedside, Dr. Sanchez entered with a serious expression. "Mr. Mendoza, we have the results of the cardiac tests," he announced. "Your mother needs urgent surgery. Without it, her chances are limited." Carlos felt as though the ground was giving way beneath him. "How much does it cost? I'll do whatever it takes." The doctor mentioned an amount that left Carlos pale, his funds frozen due to the ongoing investigation and no access to the mysterious inheritance. He felt utterly helpless. At that moment, Eleanor woke up. Carlos weakly called her, trying to ask about a painting at home before Elena fell into a restless and troubled sleep. Carlos shook his head and said to Detective Ramirez, "My mother mentioned something about a painting at home that might be important." Ramirez, though skeptical, agreed to follow up. They went to the Mendoza residence and found the painting, an old family portrait. Carlos removed it with trembling hands, revealing a hidden safe. "We'll need a warrant to open it." Later, with the warrant in hand, they opened the safe, discovering documents, antiques, and a bulky envelope. Carlos opened it to find a significant amount of cash and a note from Elena that read, "For emergencies, use it wisely, my son." Carlos looked at Ramirez with tears in his eyes. "She always knew that one day he would need it, even if I was the one in trouble." The detective nodded understandingly, noting that it could cover the surgery. "But remember, Mr. Mendoza, you still have pending issues with the judge." Carlos nodded, aware that this discovery was just the beginning of a long road to redemption. The waiting room outside the operating room was a limbo of anxiety and regret for Carlos, each tick of the clock a reminder of his past mistakes. Elena had been in surgery for over 3 hours, her fragile heart in the hands of skilled surgeons. Suddenly, Lucia, the nurse who had cared for Elena at home, arrived. "I never thought we'd end up like this," Lucia murmured, breaking the heavy silence. Carlos looked at her, noticing for the first time the dark circles under her eyes. "I know I don't deserve it." Lucia sighed. "I'm not doing this for you, Carlos." For her part, though her words were harsh, they were filled with truth. Carlos nodded, unable to argue. Suddenly, the doors of the medical office swung open. Carlos exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath. "She's been transferred to the ICU," the doctor said. "But remember, her condition is delicate. She will need time and care to recover." As the doctor walked away, Lucia spoke up. "I'll stay with her. You need to sort things out with the justice system. It's the least you owe your mother." Embarrassed and filled with shame, Carlos prepared for another round of interrogations, determined to make things right, no matter the personal cost. The interrogation room was cold and austere, mirroring Carlos's state of mind. Before him, Detective Ramirez laid out a series of documents on the metal table. "Mr. Mendoza," Ramirez began, his voice heavy with gravity, "the charges against you are serious. Abandonment of a vulnerable person, negligence, and possible fraud." Carlos nodded, his face a mask of remorse. "I know, Detective. I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions." Ramirez scrutinized him, searching for any sign of deceit. "Is there anything else?" he continued. "We're investigating the alleged inheritance. It seems there are discrepancies in the documents we found." Carlos's heart skipped a beat. "Discrepancies? I don't understand." "Some signatures appear to be forged, and the dates don't match the records," Ramirez explained. Carlos sank into his chair, stunned. Perhaps the entire tragedy had been triggered by a lie. At that moment, a young officer hurried in, whispering something into Ramirez's ear. The call from the hospital. Ramirez's voice was tense as he continued, "Your mother has woken up, and she's asking for you. But there's more. She has crucial information about the inheritance and your father." The world seemed to freeze for Carlos. What secrets had Elena kept all these years? And more importantly, would he have a chance to redeem himself before it was too late? "I need to see her," Carlos pleaded. "Please." Ramirez considered for a moment before nodding. "We'll take you to the hospital. But remember, Mendoza, this doesn't change your legal situation." As they escorted him out of the station, Carlos felt a mix of fear and hope. The answers he had been seeking were within reach, but at what cost? The journey felt endless. As Carlos moved forward, escorted by Ramirez and another officer, his heart pounded heavily. A mix of anxiety and hope churned in Carlos's chest as he arrived at Elena's room. He paused at the window, observing his pale but awake mother talking with Lucia, the nurse. Noticing his presence, Lucia nodded for him to enter. "Come in, Mum," Carlos whispered, moving closer to the bed. Elena slowly turned her head. Though exhausted, her eyes sparkled with a clarity Carlos hadn't seen in years. "Mr. Mendoza," Ramirez gently interjected. "I need to speak with my son alone first," Elena said softly. Ramirez hesitated, but eventually agreed, stepping out with Lucia. Once alone, Elena grasped Carlos's hand. "There's so much you need to know about the inheritance and your father. It's not what you think." Carlos listened in astonishment as Elena unveiled a tale of sacrifice and hidden truths. His father wasn't the businessman he believed, but a compulsive gambler who left the family destitute. The supposed inheritance was a fund Elena had secretly amassed over the years, saving every penny to secure Carlos's future. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Carlos asked, tears streaming down his face. "I wanted to protect you," Elena replied. "I hoped you would mature enough to understand the true value of family and sacrifice." Elena's words pierced Carlos's heart like daggers. Everything he had done, driven by greed and resentment, was based on a lie he had constructed himself. "Mom," Carlos began, but Elena interrupted. "I know, son, and I forgive you. But now you need to do what's right." Carlos nodded, finally grasping the weight of his actions and the long road to redemption ahead. Detective Ramirez listened intently as Carlos, with a broken voice, relayed the truth Elena had revealed. In the makeshift operations center, officers took notes and checked information in real time. "So, there was no multi-million-dollar inheritance?" Ramirez asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and understanding. Carlos shook his head. "Just my mother's life savings. She sacrificed everything for me," he said, his voice faltering. From her bed, Elena extended a trembling hand to her son. "What's important now is that you know," she said softly, and that you can make things right. Her face, processing the new information, reflected the gravity of the situation. This changes things, Ramirez said. It doesn't erase your actions, but it certainly sheds new light on the case. At that moment, Lucia burst into the room. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here insisting on seeing Mrs. Mendoza. He says he has crucial information. As Carlos saw an older man with a distinguished appearance standing in the doorway, Elena's eyes widened in recognition. Miguel! She exclaimed in surprise. The man stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Elena, ready to reveal what he had discovered. Carlos was dazed as he faced Elena, who was about to unveil yet another secret. Carlos, this is Miguel. He's actually your biological father. The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos felt as though the ground had vanished beneath him as a new, even more complicated and painful truth began to reveal itself. Elena's disclosure was like a bombshell exploding in the room. Stunned, Carlos staggered back, his gaze shifting between his mother and the man now introduced as his real father. What? How? Carlos stammered, unable to process the news. Miguel stepped forward, his expression a mix of regret and hope. Carlos, I know this is overwhelming. I never intended for things to end up this way, he said. Elena, though weak, spoke firmly. The man you believed was your father never knew the truth. Miguel and I were involved long before my marriage. Sensing the rising tension, Ramirez stepped in. It seems you need some privacy. We'll be outside if you need us. Once alone, Miguel addressed Carlos. I've been keeping track of your life from afar. When I realized what had happened, I knew it was time to reveal the truth. Shocked, Carlos sank into a chair. My entire life has been a lie, he said. No, Carlos, Elena replied firmly. The love we shared was genuine. The circumstances were complicated. Miguel added, I never wanted to abandon you. Elena and I decided that a stable family was best for you. We made mistakes, he acknowledged, but I'm here now, ready to help if you'll let me. Elena reached out to Carlos. Perhaps this is a chance for a fresh start for all of us. Carlos remained silent, his mind swirling with emotions. The long-sought truth, now exposed, was more intricate and painful than he had ever expected, but amidst the turmoil, a glimmer of hope began to shine. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of possibilities. The atmosphere was thick with contained emotions and newly unveiled truths as Carlos, still grappling with the torrent of information, rose and walked towards the window, gazing out at the urban landscape. I need a moment, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Elena and Miguel exchanged worried glances, and it was Elena who broke the silence. Carlos, I understand this is overwhelming, but there's one more thing you should know. Slowly, Carlos turned his weary face towards her. What more could there be, Mother? Miguel stepped forward. The reason I'm here, beyond revealing the truth about your paternity, is that I can assist with your legal situation. Carlos looked at him skeptically. How? I'm a lawyer, Miguel explained, and I have connections that might help lessen the consequences of your actions, though not erase them. With a mix of gratitude and suspicion, Carlos asked, Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Miguel replied simply, Because you're my son, and I want the chance to make amends for my past mistakes. Eleanor, from her bed, watched the exchange with tear-filled eyes. We've all made mistakes, but perhaps this is our chance to heal and be the family we were meant to be. Carlos closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decisions before him. When he opened them, there was a new resolve in his gaze. Okay, he said finally. I'll accept your help, Miguel. Mother, I'll try to understand, but I need time. As the tension began to ease, a beam of sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating the room as if the universe itself was signaling that despite the secrets and lies, there was hope for a fresh start. The following days were a whirlwind of legal questions and emotional upheaval. True to his promise, Miguel threw himself into Carlos's case, working tirelessly to negotiate with the prosecution. Meanwhile, Carlos split his time between the hospital caring for Elena and lengthy discussions with his newly discovered father. One afternoon, as Elena slept, Carlos and Miguel met in the hospital cafeteria. "I spoke with the prosecutor," Miguel said, his voice weary yet hopeful. "They're willing to consider a reduced sentence if you agree to plead guilty to lesser charges and undergo therapy and community service." Carlos nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "How long?" "Between several months and a year, mostly on probation," Miguel replied. "But Carlos, this isn't just about avoiding prison. It's about redemption, about making things right." "I know," Carlos murmured, his gaze fixed on the coffee cup before him. "Everything has changed so quickly. It feels like I'm living someone else's life." Miguel reached out, hesitating before placing a hand on Carlos's shoulder. "I understand, and I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm here for you. I'll be here. I know I can't make up for years of absence, but thank you for being here now to help," Carlos said, surprising them both with the sincerity in his voice. The only sound in the room was the faint murmur of hospital activity. At that moment, he realized that despite the pain and suffering, confusion faced the chance for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild not just his life, but also his family. The courtroom fell silent as Carlos stood to hear his sentence. Elena, still weak but resolute, sat in the front row with Miguel by her side. Lucia, the nurse, was also present, her face a mix of concern and support. "Carlos Mendoza," began the judge, his voice resonating in the courtroom. "This court has carefully considered the charges against you and the mitigating circumstances presented by your defense." Carlos, holding his head high but with his hands slightly trembling, listened as the judge continued. "You are sentenced to 1 year of probation, 500 hours of community service at a nursing home, and mandatory weekly therapy. Additionally, you must financially compensate your mother for the medical expenses incurred due to your actions." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Carlos exhaled, a blend of relief and determination on his face. "Mr. Mendoza," the judge added, his tone gentler, "this court hopes you will use this time to reflect on your actions and reconcile with your past. The true sentence will be the one you impose on yourself on the path to redemption." As the gavel came down, marking the end of the session, Carlos turned to his family. Elena smiled at him through tear-filled eyes, while Miguel nodded in approval. "It's a new beginning, son," Elena said gently as Carlos approached. "I know, Mom," Carlos replied, taking her hands and promising, "I won't waste this chance." As they left the courtroom, Carlos felt the weight of responsibility but also a glimmer of hope. Months after the sentencing, Carlos was in the garden of the Golden Sunset Elder Care Center, where he was fulfilling his community service. The afternoon sun bathed the area in a warm light as he assisted a group of residents with their gardening session. "Dear Carlos," called Doña Matilde, one of the oldest residents, "could you hand me those sunflower seeds?" With a genuine smile, Carlos approached and knelt beside her. "Here you go, Doña Matilde. Would you like me to help you plant them?" "No," the elderly woman replied with a wink. "These hands still have life in them, but stay close just in case." As he watched Doña Matilde work the soil with surprising skill, Carlos reflected on the changes in his life. Though difficult at first, he was gradually learning to cope with his guilt and rebuild his relationship with Elena. At that moment, Carlos saw Miguel approaching down the garden path. "Hello, son," Miguel greeted, watching the scene with approval. Carlos, busy with his hands, nodded. "It's therapeutic, you know, working here. It makes me see things differently." Miguel smiled. "Your mother will be proud when I tell her. I came to remind you about dinner tonight. Elena insisted on cooking herself." The mention of his mother brought a mix of emotions to Carlos. Elena had made a remarkable recovery, and though she still had moments of confusion, her strength and unconditional love had not wavered. "I'll be there," Carlos promised, not wanting to miss it for anything. As Miguel said his goodbyes, Carlos turned his attention back to the residence. For the first time in a long while, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be, doing the right thing. The road to redemption was long, but each small act of kindness brought him a little closer to the person he wanted to become. Elena's kitchen was bustling with activity and delicious aromas when Carlos arrived that evening. His mother, in a floral apron and with a radiant smile, stirred a steaming pot. "Carlos, you're here," Elena exclaimed, welcoming him with a hug. Carlos embraced her gently, noting that despite being frail, Elena seemed stronger and more spirited than in months. "It smells wonderful, Mom. Do you need any help?" "You can set the table," she replied, returning to her cooking. "Miguel will be here soon." While Carlos was setting the table, he noticed an envelope on the dining room table. "What's this, Mom?" Elena turned with a proud expression on her face. "Open it. It's for you." Curiously, Carlos opened the envelope, finding a letter from the Golden Sunset Center. His eyes widened in surprise as he read quickly. "They're offering me a job?" he asked incredulously. Elena nodded. "I called this morning. They said you did an exceptional job and want to hire you as the activities coordinator once your community service is completed." Carlos was speechless, overwhelmed with emotion. At that moment, Miguel entered the kitchen, smiling at Carlos's expression. "I don't know what to say," Carlos murmured. "After everything I've done," Elena approached, taking her son's hands. "This is what happens when you open your heart. Forgiveness and redemption are possible." As the three of them sat down for dinner, Carlos felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey had been difficult, but here he was, surrounded by love and with a new opportunity on the horizon. Life, he thought, sometimes offers second chances when least expected. A year after that family dinner, Carlos was at the entrance of the Golden Sunset Center, greeting a group of new residents. His role as the activities coordinator had given him a renewed sense of purpose, and the sparkle in his eyes reflected the satisfaction of a life rebuilt.